Hello and welcome to the Terran Space Academy, where we help prepare you for a bright future in the space industry. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and help support us on Patreon if you can. There are links in the description to Patreon and our Academy store. Today we are going to discuss an inherent risk that comes with working in the space industry. Since this lesson addresses subjects that I have classified training in, we will draw today's lecture only from easily accessible unclassified sources. Sometimes you can have the best of intentions and still end up losing everything. While you might be working hard to advance humanity into the solar system, someone, somewhere, might be working hard to turn your ideas into a weapon. Now, if we criminalize every tool that can be used for evil, we couldn't have hammers. But space is not just hard, it's expensive. And those most willing to fund space research are almost always national governments and militaries. We all know that while von Braun wanted to colonize Mars, the Nazi party he joined wanted to colonize all of Europe. Von Braun was able to develop his rockets, called the V2, only because they had a military purpose. And this brings us to another complicated man in the space industry. This is Gerald Vincent Bull. He was born March 9, 1928 in North Bay, Ontario, Canada, to George L. Toussaint Bull, an attorney, and Gertrude Isabelle Labrosse. Gerald had been born into a well-off family. His father had even been offered the position of King's Counsel in 1928. But 1929 changed everything, as it did for so many around the world during that time. Gerald's father had borrowed money to invest in the stock market, a very common thing to do back then, and the crash of 1929 wiped him out. The ensuing Great Depression made it impossible for him to rebuild. George lost everything, and had to move from North Bay to Toronto to look for work. Gerald's mother, Gertrude, suffered complications while giving birth to her 10th child, and died in April of 1931. This was also a very common occurrence in the past. George suffered a nervous breakdown and started drinking heavily, and left his children with his sister Laura. Laura developed cancer and died in 1934, and the bank foreclosed on her home. Gerald ended up living with his older sister Bernice. Gerald was a very precocious child, and obviously very intelligent. His aunt and uncle, Philippe and Edith Labrosse, had won $175,000 in the Irish sweepstakes, a fortune at that time. And in 1938, at the age of 10, Gerald started spending summers with them. He was admitted to a Jesuit school in Kingston, Ontario, and although technically too young to attend, the school made an exception for him. It was during this time that he became interested in flight, designing and building wooden airplanes, and becoming a member of the school's model airplane club. He graduated in 1944 at the age of 16. Philip had dreams of Gerald becoming a physician, and had secured a position for him in medical school at the University of Toronto. Gerald declined, however, and instead asked if he could have a position in the new aeronautical engineering course that had just started at Queen's University. Gerald hoped to go on to military officers training. The Department of Aeronautical Engineering at Queen's University, being brand new, was eager for students, and accepted Gerald into the undergraduate program, even though he was still only 16 years old. Though obviously brilliant, Gerald did not stand out in his academic achievements, having average grades. After graduating from college, he took a drafting job at AV Row, Canada. But he still had dreams of studying spaceflight. And later that same year, the University of Toronto opened a new Institute of Aerodynamics under the guidance of Dr. Gordon Patterson. This is now the Institute for Aerospace Studies. The institute could afford only 12 graduate students at a time. That meant accepting 3 per year for a 4-year period. Funding came from the Canadian Defence Research Board, also called the DRB. Gerald applied and was accepted at Patterson's personal recommendation, who felt that Gerald's energy and inventiveness would make up for any lack of academic achievement. Gerald and fellow student Doug Henshaw, along with 2 others, were given the task of building a supersonic wind tunnel, which was, at that time, a very rare device. The Royal Canadian Air Force donated land for the project, and the Institute wanted to open its new proving grounds with a working tunnel. Gerald and the others worked tirelessly right up until the last night that it was to open, but having finished at 3 in the morning without sufficient time to run a test. Air Marshal Wilfred Curtis arrived at the ceremony and pushed the start button for the wind tunnel. And nothing happened. Dr. Patterson quickly reached around the Air Marshal and pushed the button harder. The wind tunnel started up and ran perfectly. Gerald used the wind tunnel as the basis for his master's thesis on the design and construction of advanced wind tunnels, and had largely finished his PhD thesis on the same topic by 1950, when a request from the Defense Research Board came to the Institute, asking that an aerodynamicist be provided to help on the Canadian Velvet Glove missile project. Gerald would be paid through his normal PhD stipend from the university, under the Canadian Armament and Research Development Establishment, or CARDE. CARDE was a joint Canadian-British operation to study artillery and ballistics. It had been started during World War II in Canada to help keep British technology away from German spies. CARDE was one of a few research divisions that continued to be funded after the war. CARDE was researching supersonic flight and was working on several rocket and missile projects. Gerald wanted to build a wind tunnel for the research, but it was thought to be too expensive. He decided that firing rocket and missile models out of existing gun barrels would allow them to collect data on supersonic flight at a much lower cost. First, they fired them from an Ordnance QF 17-pounder barrel bored to 99 millimeters. The aerodynamicists wanted to use larger models, and Gerald bored out a 150 millimeter smoothbore. Large cardboard cards were placed along the flight path, and the models were placed in an aluminum sabot, which peeled away after leaving the barrel. The model would then punch through the large cardboard cards, leaving a clear silhouette of their orientation. The range was 910 meters long, and the cards were positioned at 91-meter intervals. A metallic coating on the cards permitted timing of flight progress to measure velocity. Sclaren photography was used to record the shock waves and wake around the projectile. This technique was superior to wind tunnel study as it allowed for real-world testing of theoretical calculations. Gerald defended his thesis in March 1951, becoming, at 23 years old, the youngest PhD graduate from the Institute. He still is. Gerald met and married Mimi Gilbert in 1954. The bride's father gave the couple a small house as a wedding gift. In 1954, Gerald worked with professors at Laval University in Quebec City to build a wind tunnel similar to the one he had built earlier at the University of Toronto. It was completed in 1955 and was capable of speeds of up to Mach 4, having cost only $6,000. Gerald had frugally used scrap metal for many of the parts. Gerald was written up in the Toronto Telegram with a story about a cannon that fired missiles at 4,550 miles per hour, and life was good for Gerald Bull. His first son, Philippe, was born on July 3, 1955, followed by a second son, Michel, in November 1956. Gerald was now a world expert in supersonic flight, smoothbore high-velocity guns, the use of sabots for increasing performance, and hardened electronics, able to withstand the tremendous G-forces the missile was subjected to. Work on the Velvet Glove project ended in 1956, and research efforts wound down in the post-war political environment. CARDE's funding was dramatically cut back, and the UK handed everything over to the Canadians. This made Gerald angry, and he felt that the UK and Canadian governments were being short-sighted, calling them second-rate lawyers and jumped-up real estate salesmen. After the launch of Sputnik in 1957, Gerald thought of the potential to use one of his guns to place something in orbit. Could a cannon be a first stage? Or be mounted in the second stage of a missile or rocket system? Or be used as a third stage to put a satellite into orbit? And more importantly, was it possible to build a gun big enough that it could place a satellite into orbit from the surface of the Earth? The very first science fiction movie about exploring the moon used this concept. One of the main problems with this idea is that the projectile would be subjected to extreme G-forces, in excess of 15,000 Gs. This would of course kill any human being and destroy most cargo. But Gerald thought that if he could build a big enough gun and use slower burning powder, he might be able to get an intact satellite into orbit. The reason for the slower burning powder is counterintuitive. We would think that a high explosive detonation would generate the best velocity. It does generate the highest acceleration, but that's not the goal. Think of a cannon as a kind of rocket with a fixed combustion chamber that it leaves behind. You have to burn all of your fuel and oxidizer, before you leave the end of the barrel. The secret to reducing acceleration stress is to time the combustion to complete just as the projectile leaves the end. This will have the same change in velocity, but over a longer time, as a more powerful detonation at the start of the barrel. And acceleration is change in velocity over change in time. Gerald leaked a story to the Toronto Telegraph that Canada would soon place a high-velocity gun in the nose of a U.S. Army Redstone missile to spur interest in this technology. Shortly after the story came out, Gerald was visited by an American Lieutenant General named Arthur Trudeau. No relation to the current Prime Minister of Canada that I'm aware of. General Trudeau was the director of the U.S. Army Research and Development Program at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and he told Gerald that a Dr. Charles Murphy had built an analog of Gerald's gun at Aberdeen, creating a 130mm version that had been used to fire projectiles into the Atlantic. The U.S. was using fire control radar from a Nike Hercules missile battery to track the projectiles, which were designed to release a cloud of chaff at altitudes above 40,000 meters. Both Gerald and Murphy started working on firing models of rockets from their guns. Gerald managed to take shadowgraph photos of it showing supersonic shot cones. He then used the same method to work on the Avro Arrow for the Canadian government, discovering an instability that led to the use of a stability augmentation system. But work on the Avro Arrow was soon cancelled, again angering Gerald and many other Canadians. Gerald resigned from CARDE and was soon appointed as a professor at McGill University. Gerald appeared to enjoy the new position and later described it as a marriage made in heaven. He remained in contact with his counterparts in the United States and the University of Toronto and set about equipping McGill University with the instrumentation it would need to be a leader in the field of aerodynamics. Gerald and Mimi purchased a 2,000-acre plot of land on the Quebec-Vermont border and donated it to be used by McGill and turned into a new ballistics lab. Renamed Highwater Station due to the local village of Highwater, Quebec, there they began working with 127mm and 178mm artillery pieces. In 1961, Gerald Bull visited Murphy and Trudeau at Aberdeen and was able to interest them in the idea of using guns to launch missile components for re-entry research. This was much cheaper than using rockets for the same purpose. They were able to secure funding under the High Altitude Research Project, HARP, not to be confused with HARP, and now they got to play with the big guns, so to speak. To this point, the largest gun Gerald had built had a diameter of 178mm. The U.S. Navy gave the project a 406mm battleship gun. This gun was rifled, meaning it had grooves on the inside to spin the projectile. This is good for military projectiles, but would be a little hard on a satellite. The gun was rebored into a 16.4-inch or 417mm smoothbore. Doing this only cost $2,000 at that time. The performance of the gun was so great that the Highwater site was too small to support it. McGill University had long been running a meteorological station on the island of Barbados and suggested that it would make an ideal location for the gun to be set up. Gerald met with Barbados' first Prime Minister after Barbados received its independence from the UK in 1966. Mr. Barrow became an enthusiastic supporter of HARP and arranged for a firing site at Paragon on the southeast coast of the island near the Sewell Airport. The guns had to be offloaded 11 kilometers up the coast at Foul Bay and then transported over land by a railway, built only for that purpose. The project employed over 300 permanently and earned Mr. Barrow's continued support. Gerald encouraged local workers to use the project as a means to start a science or engineering degree. This attitude earned him a lot of support in Barbados. In January 1962, the first test shot was carried out with an empty sabot and was completely successful. The second firing was made with a projectile named Martlet, named for the mythical bird on the McGill University crest. By the end of 1962, the 150-kilogram martlets were being fired at over 3,048 meters per second, reaching altitudes of 66,000 meters. This means that Gerald Bull's first attempt at a space cannon achieved a delta V of 3 kilometers per second. The Falcon 9 today has an initial mass of 549 metric tons. It has 395.7 metric tons of propellant in the first stage. If it burns all that propellant, that leaves a mass of 153.3 metric tons at first stage burnout. With a specific impulse of 282 seconds, generated by the kerosene and oxygen burning Merlin engines. We get an exhaust velocity of 2,766 meters per second. If we put that into our rocket equation, we get a delta V of about 3.5 kilometers per second. Gerald kept improving his project, and the Martlets evolved through this period, growing in size and sophistication. Martlet 2A was the first high-altitude projectile. It had a mass of just over 100 kilograms. The forebody carried electronics, and the aft body carried a chemical payload, which could be deployed at high altitude, allowing the scientists to study conditions in the upper atmosphere. The electronics triggered the release of the chemical markers at a set altitude. By using triethyl aluminum, which burns on contact with air and is often used to start rocket engines, the projectile would leave a bright trail that could be observed by telescope. This could be used to measure wind speeds at those altitudes. The Martlets could also release chaff, which is small metal flakes, allowing tracking by radar. Some shots used additional electronics to measure the Earth's magnetic field. The acquisition of this data was vital to ICBM design, as re-entering warheads impact and traverse this part of the atmosphere at hypersonic velocities. Each launch cost about $5,000, and up to 8 firings a night were accomplished for up to 3 nights in a row. The final missiles were 127 millimeters in diameter and had a very heavy pusher plate. The entire mass accelerated was around 204.5 kilograms. Then came the Martlet 2C, and finally a 160 kilogram missile. After about 1,000 firings, the U.S. military felt they had enough high-altitude data and could move on to other research. The data collected by Gerald's HARP project represents half of all the upper atmospheric data we have to this day. With Project HARP winding down, Gerald turned his attention to his real dream: a gun-launched rocket that could reach outer space. The gun he had already built was easily capable of firing a projectile over intercontinental distances. But to put something in space, he would need a more advanced projectile. In early 1963, Gerald designed a 177.8 millimeter diameter solid fuel artillery shell that could be fired from his guns. The projectile had a solid shell fuel with a soft rubber consistency, with an opening in the middle. On firing, this fuel would tend to collapse into the cavity, and he solved this problem by filling the cavity with zinc bromide, which prevented the collapse and was drained after firing to allow the rocket to light. Test firings began at the U.S. Ballistic Research Laboratory in Aberdeen, using a bored-out 175mm gun from the M107. This program proved the basic concept, and shots of the Martlet 3 reached altitudes of 249 kilometers. The ultimate goal of the program was the Martlet 4, a 3-stage rocket that would be fired from a lengthened gun in Barbados and would reach orbit. In 1964, Donald Mordell was able to convince the Canadian government of the value of the HARP project as a low-cost method for Canada to enter the space launch business, and arranged a joint Canadian-U.S. funded program of $3 million a year for 3 years, with the Canadians supplying $2.5 million of that. Another gun was being tested at the high-water range and was extended by cutting the breech off the end of one gun and welding it to the end of another, to produce a new gun over 110 feet long. This extension allowed the powder to be contained for a longer period of time, slowing down the acceleration and loads on the airframe, while also offering higher overall performance. The second barrel was shipped to Foul Bay, attached and strengthened with external bracing to allow it to be raised from the horizontal. This gun was extensively tested in 1965 and 1966. Originally guaranteed 3 years of funding, the money for the project was handled by the Canadian Defence Research Board, who really did not want to fund this project when its own funding had been dramatically cut. Although the money was allocated for 1964, the DRB managed to delay delivery for 10 months, forcing McGill to cover salaries in the interim. These problems did not go unnoticed in the U.S. Army, and in order to ensure that firings would not be interrupted by problems on the Canadian side, a third double-length gun was built at the Yuma Proving Grounds to continue the high-altitude research. By 1967, it was becoming clear that the Martlet 4 would not be ready by the time the funding ran out in 1968. An effort started to build a simplified version, the GLO-1A, or Gun-Launched Orbiter version 1A, based on the Martlet 2G started. Continued budget pressures, changing public attitudes toward military affairs, negative reviews from the press and other researchers in Canada, and a change of government, all conspired to ensure that Canadian funding was not renewed in 1967. Gerald made a last-ditch effort to launch a Canadian flag into orbit in time for the Canadian Centennial to keep the project alive, but funding ran out before this was accomplished. Gerald was by now very bitter, and he returned to the high-water range and transferred his interest in HARP's assets to a new company. He invoked a clause in the original contract with McGill University that required them to return the range to its original natural condition. Faced with hundreds of thousands of dollars in construction costs, McGill was left with little choice but to trade Bull for title to the high-water equipment. Setting up a new company, Space Research Corporation, Gerald became an international artillery consultant. He incorporated his company in both Quebec and Vermont, and quickly earned a number of contracts from both the Canadian and U.S. military research arms. He went on to establish a space program at Norwich University in Northfield, Vermont. At SRC, Bull continued the development of his high-velocity artillery, adapting the HARP smoothbore into a new reverse-rifled design, where the lands of a conventional rifling were replaced by grooves cut into the barrel, to make a slightly larger gun also capable of firing existing ammunition. Normally, artillery shells are sealed into the rifling by a driving band of soft metal like copper, which demands that the shell be shaped so that it bounces at its widest point, where the band is located. This is not ideal for ballistics, especially supersonically, where a higher fineness ratio is desirable. Bull solved this problem by using an additional set of fins near the front of the shell to keep it centered in the barrel, allowing the driving band to be greatly reduced in size and located wherever was convenient. Reshaping the shell for better supersonic performance provided dramatically improved range and accuracy, up to double in both cases, when compared to a similar gun using older style ammunition. He called the new shell design Extended Range Full Bore, abbreviated ERFB. In 1975, Gerald designed a new gun based on the US 155/39 M109 howitzer, extending it through modifications that could be applied to existing weapons, calling the resulting weapon the GC-45 howitzer. Gerald also used what was called base bleed technology, being developed in Sweden, which allowed for further improvements in range. With an ERFB round, the GC-45 could routinely place rounds in 10-meter circles at ranges up to 30 kilometers away, and could fire a shell 38 kilometers with a little loss in accuracy. The gun offered ranges far in excess of even the longest-range heavy artillery, and was only slightly larger than common medium-weight guns. Space Research Corporation sold 50,000 ERFB shells to Israel in 1973 for use in American-supplied artillery pieces. The Israelis had successfully used a number of 175mm M107 guns in the counter-battery role against its Soviet counterpart, the 130mm towed field gun M1954. But the introduction of long-range rockets fired from Lebanon outranged them. The ERFB shells extended the range of the already formidable M107 to as much as 50 kilometers, allowing the guns to counter-battery even the longest-range rockets available to their enemy. Gerald's benefit to American and Allied national security was rewarded by a congressional bill sponsored by Senator Barry Goldwater that made Gerald an American citizen retroactive for 10 years, and granting him a high-level American nuclear security clearance. Everything seemed to be going well for Gerald. He had been helpful to both the Canadian and U.S. governments, aiding them in defending themselves against potential enemies. They trusted him, and he trusted them, and this would lead to his downfall. In 1977, the President of the United States was Jimmy Carter. Mr. Carter was very different from his predecessors, Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Whereas fighting communism and staying president was all Nixon really seemed to care about, Carter cared about international law and human rights. President Carter did not like the apartheid government of South Africa, perhaps because South Africa blatantly reminded the United States of what its society had been like just a decade before. President Carter, with the help of the United Nations, placed sanctions and arms sale restrictions on South Africa. Combating communism was no longer the sole factor of consideration in U.S. policy, and South Africa's failed human rights record under apartheid justified this action in Carter's eyes. The United States government is not a single coordinated entity. It has, in fact, become so large and powerful that it is now composed of several, sometimes competing factions. While CIA leadership often changes with the presidential administration, the CIA case and operations officers do not. Until the fall of the Soviet Union, South Africa was America's main source of the metal titanium. But South Africa, at this time, was fighting communists from Angola. and South Africa needed long-range artillery. In 1977, the CIA came to Space Research Corporation and suggested that the U.S. government would be very grateful if a large number of these shells were sold to a third party, who might, with the help of the Israeli military industries, perhaps then sell them to South Africa, in order to counter the modern artillery the Soviet Union had made available to the Angolans. SRC arranged the sale of 30,155 mm artillery shells, with gun barrels and plans for the GC-45 howitzer, as well as radar equipment, to Arms Corps, the South African State Arms Corporation, with 2 shipments made through Antigua in 1978 and another through Spain in 1979. The resulting guns were vital to South African campaigns against Cuban expeditionary forces in Angola, allowing them to target infrastructure and personnel with phenomenal accuracy. But other agencies of the U.S. government had tracked these sales and asked SRC and Gerald about them. Gerald naively thought that everything would be okay. He was helping the U.S. government after all. But the CIA denied ever asking SRC to sell anything to South Africa, arguing it would never even suggest that an American citizen should break the law. Gerald was arrested for illegal arms dealing in contravention of UN Security Council Resolution 418. He had not tried to hide the transactions and, with the U.S. government refusing to tell the truth, he had no defense. 15 people had been involved in the sale, but Gerald and one of his business partners, Rogers Gregory, agreed to plead guilty if the others weren't charged. This was the honorable thing to do, but it meant that he did not get to place evidence of his good intentions into the public record. Instead of a fine that would be normally expected for a first offense, they were sentenced to 6 months in the Federal Correctional Complex, Allenwood, Pennsylvania in 1980. After Gerald's release, he was again charged, this time in Canadian courts, being accused of transferring technology on 155 mm extended range shells to China without the necessary export permits, and was fined 55,000 Canadian dollars for international arms dealing. Gerald left prison near bankruptcy and very disillusioned. He felt that both of the countries he had served had betrayed him. He left Canada and moved to Brussels, Belgium, opening a subsidiary of Space Research Corporation called European Poudres Rayonnés de Belgique. Please be merciful on that one, my French friends. Belgium was and is a center of arms commerce in the world. SRC continued working with the ERFB ammunition design, developing a range of munitions that could be fired from existing weapons, combining a new barrel from the M109 with Bull's ERFB ammunition to produce an improved weapon for relatively low cost. They also continued working with the GC-45 design, and soon secured more work with the People's Republic of China, which was perfectly legal for a Belgian company to do. Then he was contacted by the government of Iraq. The United States was supporting Iraq at this time in its war against Iran. Iran had gone through a revolution in 1978, and the United States had lost an ally when the Shah of Iran was deposed and removed from power. Saddam Hussein had taken power in Iraq in 1979, and with the encouragement and support of the United States, had started a war with Iran. That war had lasted a decade, and Iraq's failure to defeat Iran had turned parts of the U.S. government against Saddam Hussein. Space Research Corporation designed 2 artillery pieces for the Iraqis, a 155 mm updated version of the G5, and a similar set of adaptations applied to the 203 mm U.S. M110 howitzer, producing a 210 mm gun with a maximum range of 56 kilometers. These soon quickly started out competing Soviet designs. When deliveries could not be made quickly enough, additional barrels were ordered from South Africa, and the guns were built and sold through an Austrian intermediary. It was during this time, in 1988, that Gerald personally traveled to Iraq and came to the attention of Saddam Hussein. Saddam was interested in having SRB build Iraq the largest gun in history, and gave him $25 million to get it done. Gerald gave the project a lot of thought and did some research. We spoke earlier about the Vengeance Weapon 1, or V1, which was an early cruise missile designed and used by Nazi Germany. We also spoke about the Vengeance Weapon 2, an alcohol-powered rocket turned into a ballistic missile that was used to drop high-explosive warheads on London during World War II. But there was one more Vengeance weapon. Hitler had also developed plans for a Vengeance Weapon 3. Gerald knew that German engineers had built a massive 420 mm gun in 1914 during World War I. This was even larger than the Navy guns Gerald had used in Barbados. The Germans had also built the Paris gun in 1918. This was a 256-ton gun with a barrel length of 21 meters, was 238 millimeters in diameter and could fire shells up to 130 kilometers with a muzzle velocity of 1,640 meters per second. Gerald had extensively researched these guns and had even been writing a book on them. Gerald also knew that Hitler had started building the Vengeance Weapon 3. This gun was 130 meters long, with a diameter of 150 millimeters. It was designed to fire 140 kilogram shells up to 165 kilometers, at a rate of 600 shells per hour. The muzzle velocity was estimated to be about 1,500 meters per second. This weapon used multiple propellant stages along its length to provide additional force. Solid rocket fuel boosters were used instead of explosive charges. These were arranged in symmetrical pairs along the length of the barrel. This keeps the gun from needing a massive breech and can contain the expanding propellant in stages. More powerful charges can be added as the projectile accelerates. These are fired so they apply their thrust against the base of the projectile, at just the right time as it passes. The gun was made in identical sections for ease of production and could be bolted together. It fired a fin-stabilized shell to prevent tumbling in flight, as it did not spin. This produced a lower drag coefficient. Gerald first built a smaller 45mm long, 350mm diameter gun called Baby Babylon. It was completed and tested. Then Gerald started work on the next version. This gun was 150 meters long and weighed 1,510 tons. With a bore of 1 meter, it was designed to fire multi-stage rocket-assisted shells and had a range of over 8,000 kilometers. It also had the capability of launching a 540-kilogram satellite into low Earth orbit. 3 of the 350mm Baby Babylon guns and 2 of the 1,000mm Big Babylon guns were planned for construction. Construction of the individual sections of the massive guns started in England at Sheffield Forge Masters and Matrix Churchill, with some parts built in Spain, the Netherlands, and Switzerland as well. It was at this time that Gerald started to suspect that he was being followed. His apartment suffered several non-robbery break-ins, perhaps as a warning, but Gerald knew he was not breaking any laws, and felt that he had the right to build his orbital gun. On 22 March 1990, while returning to his apartment in Brussels, he was shot 5 times in the head and back at point-blank range. It was reported that when police arrived at the scene, they found the key still in his door and his unopened briefcase, containing nearly $20,000 in cash. This was an assassination, in violation of all international laws, and no government or agency admitted to being responsible for it. Rumors were that perhaps the Israelis had feared that Iraq would turn its guns on Tel Aviv. It's also possible that Iran was behind the killing, afraid that this weapon would be turned on Tehran. Within hours of the killing, according to some sources, the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad, was distributing stories to the European media, alleging that Bull had been shot by agents from Iraq, claiming the gun would not have worked and Iraq was angry at being defrauded. It could even have been the Americans, as they had turned against Saddam and would start Operation Desert Shield to drive Saddam out of Kuwait just 5 months after Gerald's death, though the U.S. favors fake suicides over obvious homicides. They might have been trying to make an example. The friend of my enemy is my enemy, to paraphrase an ancient proverb. Project Babylon was stopped, and the Supergun parts were seized by customs in the United Kingdom. Most SRC staff returned to Canada, as without Gerald's genius, there really wasn't much left to do. Some of the confiscated parts were given to museums and to the UK Ministry of Defense. In Iraq, all remaining gun barrels and propellant were destroyed by United Nations inspectors after the Persian Gulf War. Gerald's book, by the way, was published in German after his death, but there aren't many copies. You can sometimes find it on Amazon for about $225. Could someone today build a supergun able to reach orbit? The United States had been working on electromagnetic railguns. These are covered in this lesson. But for military purposes, they still require too much power to be very practical. Superconductors could help in this area, covered in this lesson. But until they can operate at high temperatures, they are also not very practical for combat. But could we build a 1-kilometer-long gun out of titanium alloy, using solid rocket motors at the joints, and powerful nitrogen-cooled, high-temperature superconducting electromagnets to boost velocity in between joints? Indeed, someone could. And a gun like this could put over 500 1,000-kilogram satellites into orbit in less than an hour. A nice solution to replacing a constellation of communication satellites, in case something or someone took them out. Something to think about. Thanks for listening, and stay safe. At Astra Pro Terra.